brings us to the sixth and the final one. It's the Unreliable Bible. And I want you to read this closely because his response really comes from a pretty accurate articulation of the defeater. He says, it seems impossible any longer to take the Bible as completely authoritative in the light of modern science, history, and culture. Also, we can't be sure what in the Bible's accounts of events is legendary and what really happened. Finally, much of the Bible's social teaching, for example, about women, is socially regressive. So how can we trust it scientifically, historically, and socially? Now, his response picks one key out of that, the most substantial one, I think. And his brief response is simply, the Gospel's form precluded there being legends. See, what he's saying is that when you look at what's actually in the Gospel, it precludes the idea that you even have to sort it out. And he makes it along these two lines. He said, number one, he says, the timing of the Gospels is far too early for them to actually be legends. All the Gospel accounts were written between 30 and 60 years after Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended. And all the letters of Paul were written around 20 years later after Jesus' death, and they confirmed all those accounts. That's way too quick for a legend. And so there's an articulation and an understanding, just technically, about how the Gospels actually were formed that prohibited those being legends, and thereby you don't have to sort out what's real and not real, because they're valid. Now, the second point is very interesting as well. I've studied a lot in the different manuscripts and so on as far as it. But he said the second point, he says their content is far too counterproductive to be legends. In other words, the account of Jesus crying out to God that God had actually abandoned him when he was on the cross, you wouldn't write that. The record of the fact that the initial witnesses to the resurrection were all women. In the first century, they wouldn't have done that. Women weren't credible witnesses then, but they were all women. You see, what he's getting at is that the content of the Gospels themselves don't make sense, that someone would be writing them just to persuade a bunch of people, because there's so much in them that is kind of inconsistent with the way they were thinking then. The only historically plausible reason that these incidents are recorded is that they actually did happen. The offensiveness of the Bible is culturally relative. Texts that you find difficult and offensive are common sense to people in other cultures. And many of the things that you find offensive because of your beliefs and convictions, many will seem silly to your grandchildren, just as many of your grandparents' beliefs offended you. Therefore, to simply reject any scripture is to assume your culture, and worse yet, your time in history, is superior to all others. It is narrow-minded and extreme. You see, he's saying that I understand that some of it doesn't quite line up with the way that you naturally think, but you're speaking from a historical moment in a cultural perspective. But in other parts of the world, even today, those things make sense. The greatest way that I saw this is all the ministry that we've done in Kenya. In the late 90s, I started going over pretty much every year. Their perspective over there is radically different than yours. The concept of coming out, of understanding tribal gods, is completely different than you. And in America, where you're dealing with people that have relatively, even many Christians, low views of God, their views of God are actually quite high. They do not have small gods. They're just the wrong ones. And appealing to a high or transcendent view of God is actually quite easy over there. Over here, it's completely implausible. And so